Mateo El Plaga Ramirez, a boy who became a killer, a child who rose to command fear, and a mastermind who turned the streets of Guadalajara into his empire, was Mexico's most dangerous young hitman. This is the story of how a child shaped by violence became a legend no one dared to challenge. In the crowded, sun-baked streets of Guadalajara's poorest neighborhoods, life was a constant battle. The air carried the smells of exhaust, cooking fires, and decay, mixing with the cries of children who had no choice but to grow up fast. It was here, amid broken homes and abandoned buildings, that Mateo Ramirez was born. From the very beginning, his life was marked by struggle. His mother worked long hours cleaning houses, barely earning enough to feed the family, while his father was absent, lost to the streets or imprisoned for petty crimes. From the moment Mateo could walk, he had to navigate a world where danger was everywhere, and innocence was a luxury few could afford. Even as a small child, Mateo seemed different from the other boys playing barefoot in the dusty streets. While they laughed and fought over stolen oranges or broken toys, Mateo observed silently, his dark eyes following every movement, every argument, every exchange of favors or threats. There was a quiet intensity in him, a focus that unnerved even adults who noticed him. Neighbors would later recall how, at the age of 7, he would sit near fights or robberies, watching without fear, as if measuring every person involved, learning their weaknesses. Poverty forced children like Mateo into the shadows, and he quickly learned that survival meant obedience. By 10, he was already running errands for local drug dealers and petty gangsters. At first, it was small tasks, delivering packages, carrying messages, or keeping watch, but each errand exposed him further to the harsh realities of crime. The sharp tang of gunpowder, the weight of money exchanged under threat, the hushed whispers of betrayal. These experiences shaped him in ways that a normal childhood never could. While other boys feared the men around them, Mateo began to see opportunity in danger. His home offered little refuge. Cracks ran through the walls, both literal and figurative. Arguments between his mother and older siblings were common, often turning violent. Mateo learned early that family could not always be trusted, and that strength and cunning were the only shields a child could wield. At school he was quiet, unremarkable, blending into the background while observing classmates, teachers, and even passing strangers. Yet beneath his small frame, there was a growing resilience, a mental sharpness that hinted at something far darker. It was during this time that he earned the nickname El Plaga, which roughly translates to the pest. The name was given not out of fear but out of acknowledgement of his relentless presence. He appeared where trouble brewed, unafraid and unyielding, capable of slipping through cracks unnoticed yet leaving an impression that lingered. To older gang members he was a curiosity at first, a child too small to be taken seriously, but they soon realized that Mateo was absorbing everything, learning the rules of the streets faster than anyone else. He memorized patterns of behavior, weaknesses and defenses, and the subtleties of intimidation and respect. By the age of 10, Mateo was no longer just a child trying to survive. He was an observer, a strategist, and an apprentice to a life that would consume him entirely. Each day hardened him, each loss sharpened him, and each small act of defiance reinforced the idea that power and survival were intimately linked. In the slums of Guadalajara, where violence was commonplace and mercy rare, Mateo El Plaga Ramirez was beginning a path that would soon make him one of the most feared figures in Mexico's criminal world. By the time Mateo Ramirez turned 12, the streets of Guadalajara had already shaped him into someone far older than his years. The boy who once ran simple errands for local criminals had begun to understand the unspoken rules of survival. Respect was earned through action, fear was a currency, and hesitation could mean death. Though most children his age were still playing games or dreaming of the future, Mateo's mind was consumed with calculating risks and observing weakness. He carried himself with a quiet confidence that made even grown men uneasy, a calm that seemed impossible for someone so young. It was during this time that his first real test came. A rival gang, seeking to expand territory, began threatening Mateo's family. His mother, already struggling to keep the household together, was terrified, but Mateo felt something different. A simmering anger and a clarity of purpose. He did not speak of it, did not cry, but instead began watching the movements of the intruders, noting their patterns, their vulnerabilities, their careless moments. While others panicked, he prepared. One night, the rival gang came too close. Mateo had taken one of the older men's pistols, while everyone slept, learning to handle it from watching others in the neighborhood. When the intruders entered, Mateo acted. The chaos was brief, but lethal. In a single, precise moment, he struck, eliminating the threat before anyone could understand what had happened. The act shocked the neighborhood. 12 years old and already capable of killing without hesitation. Neighbors whispered about the child with cold eyes, the boy who had taken life as if it were a simple task. Parents warned their children to stay away, while older criminals began to take notice. The killing marked the true birth of El Plaga, as a name spoken with caution and fear. No longer was he a mere child, running errands. He was a force of calculated violence. Local gangs began to respect him, offering him minor assignments and protection, recognizing that a mind so young yet so deadly was rare. Rumors spread of his first kill, exaggerated and distorted in the retelling, each version painting a picture of a boy who seemed fearless, almost untouchable. Mateo, however, felt no pride. Instead, he felt purpose. Violence was no longer just a part of life, it was a tool, one that could carve a path for survival, power, and recognition in a world that had offered him little else. Even at 12, Mateo began thinking beyond immediate survival. He studied human behavior, noting how fear could be manipulated, how loyalty could be secured, and how power shifted in subtle ways. Each small act of violence was not random. It was a lesson, a step toward understanding the mechanisms of control. The boy who had once been invisible in the streets had now become the center of whispered conversations and wary glances. His actions had created a legend, one that spread through the narrow alleys and open markets like wildfire, growing with every retelling. By the end of this pivotal year, Mateo Ramirez was no longer a child. He had crossed a threshold, leaving innocence behind. El Plaga had arrived, a name that would soon strike fear into the hearts of anyone who dared to oppose him. The boy's first blood was only the beginning, a harbinger of the ruthless and calculated life that lay ahead. The streets had claimed him, and in return he had claimed his place as a predator, young but deadly, destined to rise in a world where mercy was rare and power meant everything. After his first act of violence, Mateo Ramirez quickly realized that raw instinct alone would not sustain him in the dangerous world he inhabited. Survival required more than courage, it demanded skill, strategy, and an understanding of the lethal games adults played every day. At 12, while most children were still learning in classrooms or dreaming of adventures, Mateo sought guidance from those who had mastered the shadows. He became an apprentice to a seasoned hitman, a man whose reputation for ruthlessness was well known even among hardened criminals. Under this mentor, Mateo's education in death began in earnest, a curriculum far darker than any school could offer. The lessons were brutal and unrelenting. Mateo was taught to move silently, to observe without being seen, and to strike with precision. He learned how to track a target for days without leaving evidence, to anticipate reactions, and to exploit human weaknesses. Each task, no matter how small, was a test of patience and cunning. His mentor insisted that mistakes could not be tolerated, and Mateo quickly internalized the principle. By watching, memorizing, and practicing, he absorbed techniques that would take ordinary adults years to master. There were nights when he barely slept, rehearsing movements, analyzing scenarios, and imagining confrontations, his young mind already wired for cold calculation. As he honed his skills, Mateo also began to develop an unsettling sense of emotional detachment. Violence, which once caused him shock or hesitation, became a tool he wielded methodically. Each assignment, whether observing, threatening, or taking a life, was executed with a precision that seemed almost unnatural for a boy of his age. The streets taught him efficiency, his mentor refined it, and Mateo's mind stitched it into instinct. He was no longer reacting to the chaos around him. He was orchestrating it. By 13, Mateo had already taken on assignments that adults would hesitate to accept. He completed them with a level of focus and adaptability that impressed even his mentor. Word spread of the young hitman who handled dangerous missions without question, without fear, and without error. Criminals began to seek him out, offering small payments or protection in exchange for his services, and Mateo quietly accepted, understanding that every connection could be leveraged for future power. During these years, the boy who had once been invisible in the streets transformed into a calculating force. Mateo's mind, sharp and methodical, was now paired with skills that made him uniquely dangerous. He had moved beyond simple survival. He was learning control, influence, and manipulation, building a foundation that would allow him to rise far beyond what anyone could imagine for a child. By the time he turned 14, the transformation was undeniable. Mateo Ramirez was no longer just a child shaped by the streets. He was El Plaga, a young predator, learning to command the shadows, preparing for a life defined by power, fear, and calculated violence. By the time Mateo Ramirez was 15, his reputation had grown beyond the narrow streets of Guadalajara. What began as a series of errands and small jobs had transformed into strategic operations that even hardened gang members found impressive. He had become more than a hitman. He was a tactician, capable of planning, predicting, and executing with a precision that belied his age. His mentor had taught him the tools of violence, but Mateo now began to apply his own intelligence, turning instinct and training into strategy. No longer a boy, he was becoming a force within the criminal world, and those who underestimated him quickly learned their mistake. His promotions came quickly. Initially, he worked as an enforcer, handling threats and small-scale assignments, but soon he was entrusted with planning entire operations. Mateo coordinated kidnappings, extortions, and assassinations, often mapping every detail before moving. He studied rival gangs' routines, noting patterns and weaknesses, and then struck with calculated efficiency. By 15, he was orchestrating missions that even older criminals struggled to comprehend. A child leading adults who had spent years mastering the streets. The nickname El Plaga spread further, carried in whispers and warnings. Local media began reporting on a serious, highly skilled young killer, though details were scarce. Most who spoke of him exaggerated his deeds, creating a legend that grew larger with every retelling. But behind the myths, Mateo remained disciplined and meticulous, understanding that fear was a tool to be carefully wielded, not a chaotic force to rely upon. Each calculated action reinforced his image, making him a figure both feared and respected. Mateo's rise also exposed him to a darker side of loyalty and betrayal. He quickly learned that alliances in the underworld were fragile, often broken by greed, ambition, or fear. At 15, he had already experienced the sting of betrayal firsthand, watching older associates turn on each other and taking careful notes on human behavior. These experiences hardened him further, teaching him to trust sparingly and manipulate strategically. By observing the actions of adults, Mateo developed a level of insight into criminal psychology that many seasoned gang leaders lacked, giving him an advantage that extended beyond raw skill. Despite his youth, he began assembling a network of younger recruits who admired him, many of them eager to prove themselves in a dangerous world. Mateo mentored these new members, teaching them the same lessons he had learned: patience, precision, and control. His influence began to ripple across multiple factions, creating a small empire under his guidance, even as older criminals struggled to reconcile the idea that a boy was commanding respect they had spent years earning. By the end of his 15th year, Mateo had crossed a point of no return. The boy who had once delivered messages now orchestrated complex operations, balancing fear, loyalty, and strategy with an almost unnatural skill. He had transformed from apprentice to commander, establishing himself as a rising star within the criminal underworld. The streets that had once molded him now bowed to him, and the legend of El Plaga grew with each calculated move, setting the stage for a rise that would continue to astonish, terrify, and challenge the fragile balance of power across Guadalajara's gang. Despite years of careful planning and ruthless efficiency, Mateo Ramirez, now a young man commanding a powerful criminal network, could not escape the inevitable consequences of a life built on violence and secrecy. By this stage, he had expanded his operations across Guadalajara and beyond. But power always attracts attention, and Mateo's empire had grown large enough to be impossible to ignore. Law enforcement, who had once dismissed him as just another street thug, now turned their focus on El Plaga, recognizing that his influence and ruthlessness made him a serious threat. At the same time, rival cartels and gangs, envious and fearful, began strategizing against him, eager to claim territory and eliminate a figure who had long outmatched older and more experienced criminals. The first cracks appeared within his own ranks. Years of mentoring young recruits had created loyalty, but it had also bred ambition. One lieutenant, who had been with Mateo since his early teenage years, began to feel overshadowed and resentful. Quietly, he reached out to law enforcement, providing critical information on Mateo's movements, safe houses, and operations. For the first time, Mateo found that the shadows he had mastered were not enough to shield him. His empire, once untouchable, was suddenly exposed. The police raid was swift and devastating. At dawn, coordinated units surrounded multiple safe houses, capturing members of his network and seizing weapons, drugs, and cash. Mateo, despite his careful planning, narrowly escaped, but the message was clear: he was no longer untouchable. For the first time in his life, he felt the vulnerability that most criminals learn too late. His carefully constructed web of influence began to unravel as rival gangs sensed weakness and encroached on his territory. Even outside law enforcement's direct reach, betrayal and mistrust began to infect his inner circle. Some former allies shifted loyalties, seeking protection from rival factions, while others plotted to take over operations entirely. Mateo's instincts, once infallible, were tested like never before. He responded with calculated force, striking swiftly against those who threatened him, but every action carried risk, and every retaliation drew more attention. The very reputation that had once protected him now became a liability, making him a target for those who sought to challenge the legend of El Plaga. Amid the chaos, Mateo realized the limitations of his power. Despite years of meticulous planning, he had overlooked one simple truth: even the most intelligent and ruthless individuals are vulnerable when surrounded by ambition, envy, and law enforcement scrutiny. He began to reassess his strategies, retreating into secrecy and moving operations further underground. The streets he had once dominated were no longer fully under his control, and every decision now carried the weight of potential collapse. By the end of this period, it was clear that Mateo Ramirez's reign had entered a dangerous new phase. The boy who had once risen unchallenged through the ranks of Guadalajara's criminal world now faced enemies from every direction: betrayal within, law enforcement outside, and rivals waiting for any sign of weakness. The fall of El Plaga was no longer a distant possibility. It had begun, yet, even as his empire cracked, his cunning and ruthlessness remained, ensuring that he would continue to shape the criminal landscape even in retreat. The legend was far from over, but the invincibility he once enjoyed was gone, replaced by a precarious reality where one wrong move could mean the end of everything he had built. By the age of 16, Mateo Ramirez had firmly established himself as a rising force within Guadalajara's criminal underworld. But with power came enemies. Rival gangs, long aware of El Plaga's cunning and ruthlessness, saw him not just as a threat, but as a challenge to their authority. Unlike other young criminals who relied on brute force or reckless aggression, Mateo combined strategic thinking with violence, making him unpredictable and deadly. These traits, once admired by allies, now made him a prime target for those who sought to eliminate him and claim his territory. The attacks began subtly at first. Ambushes were set in alleyways he frequented, vehicles were tampered with, and trusted couriers were intercepted. Mateo's keen instincts, honed over years of observation and experience, allowed him to survive each attempt. He studied the patterns of his attackers, learning to anticipate not just their movements but their motivations. Every failed attempt on his life became a lesson, sharpening his tactics and reinforcing his reputation as someone who could survive anything. Betrayal came from unexpected quarters. Some of his own lieutenants, motivated by greed or fear, attempted to manipulate situations to their advantage. Mateo, however, was always one step ahead. He had learned to read human behavior with frightening accuracy, recognizing subtle shifts in loyalty, hesitation, or deceit. By identifying potential traitors before they acted, he neutralized threats quietly and efficiently, sending a message that disloyalty would not be tolerated. His control over his network grew stronger, not through fear alone, but through a calculated combination of intimidation, rewards, and psychological mastery. This period of Mateo's life also marked a turning point in his leadership style. Recognizing that he could not rely solely on himself, he began mentoring a new generation of young criminals. They were drawn to his legend, inspired by his skill and daring, and eager to emulate his methods. Mateo trained them meticulously, ensuring that each recruit understood the principles that had kept him alive: patience, observation, and ruthless precision. By doing so, he expanded his influence far beyond his immediate reach, creating a loyal cadre of operatives who could execute complex plans under his direction. As his network grew, so did the scope of his operations. Mateo began to exert control over entire neighborhoods, orchestrating coordinated strikes against rivals while simultaneously consolidating resources for his own enterprises. Extortion, smuggling, and small-scale assassinations became tools in his strategic arsenal, each action designed to expand power and intimidate potential challengers. His reputation as a young mastermind spread, not just through whispers among criminals, but also through law enforcement reports and media speculation. Despite constant danger, Mateo thrived. He had transformed from a solitary child assassin into a tactician capable of managing multiple layers of criminal activity. Every encounter with a rival gang, every betrayal he anticipated, reinforced his sense of invincibility, even as it honed his adaptability. By the end of this period, he had not only survived every attempt on his life, but he had turned threats into opportunities, solidifying his dominance in a world where survival was never guaranteed. Mateo Ramirez, El Plaga, had become more than a name. He had become a symbol of cunning, power, and the terrifying capabilities of a mind honed by violence from childhood. By the time Mateo Ramirez reached his late teens, he had fully transitioned from a feared hitman into a calculated leader of a growing criminal empire. His reputation as El Plaga had spread far beyond Guadalajara, whispered in fear among rival gangs, law enforcement, and even ordinary citizens. No longer a child executing orders, he now commanded operations, directed strategic hits, and oversaw networks that extended into multiple neighborhoods. Mateo had learned that power was not only about violence, it was about control, influence, and perception. Every action he took was deliberate, reinforcing his dominance while keeping rivals guessing. Mateo's transformation into a boss was marked by both ambition and intelligence. He diversified his operations, expanding into drug trafficking, extortion, and human smuggling. Each enterprise was carefully structured, with trusted lieutenants managing day-to-day operations while he oversaw strategy and expansion. Mateo was meticulous in maintaining loyalty, rewarding those who followed him faithfully and eliminating those who posed even the slightest threat. His young age, once a potential liability, became an advantage. Few expected someone so young to command such authority, and this element of surprise worked in his favor time and again. Despite his youth, Mateo understood the importance of image and perception. He cultivated a network of loyal followers who revered him, many of them young like himself, drawn to the myth of El Plaga and eager to prove themselves. These disciples were trained to emulate his methods: stealth, patience, and ruthless precision. Mateo was careful to maintain distance from direct violence, instead orchestrating operations from behind the scenes, ensuring that the legend of El Plaga remained larger than life. Every successful operation reinforced his authority and spread fear among rivals, solidifying his status as a criminal mastermind. Expansion, however, brought new challenges. Rival gangs began to recognize the threat Mateo posed, and coordinated strikes against him. Law enforcement, aware of his growing influence, started investigations that threatened to expose the inner workings of his empire. Mateo responded with the same calculated precision that had carried him through his adolescence. He moved operations underground, diversified contacts, and created multiple layers of protection, ensuring that betrayal or exposure would not dismantle his network entirely. Every setback became a lesson, every confrontation an opportunity to refine tactics and reinforce control. The transformation was not only external, but internal. Mateo's childhood had taught him to survive, but leadership required foresight, patience, and psychological mastery. He learned to read human behavior, manipulate rivals, and enforce loyalty without constant violence. By observing weaknesses, exploiting fears, and rewarding obedience, he created a structure that made his empire resilient even under pressure. His influence extended beyond immediate territory, with factions aligning themselves for protection, opportunity, or fear. By the end of this period, Mateo Ramirez was no longer the boy who had once delivered messages or executed orders. He had become a strategic criminal leader, a young man whose intellect, ruthlessness, and charisma allowed him to control a complex network that spanned Guadalajara and its outskirts. El Plaga had risen to power, a symbol of fear and ambition, demonstrating that even the youngest minds, shaped by the harshest circumstances, could command respect and inspire terror. The streets that had forged him now bowed to him, and his empire, though precarious, had grown larger than any adolescent could have imagined, setting the stage for conflicts, betrayals, and challenges that would test even his extraordinary abilities. By the time Mateo Ramirez reached his early 20s, the empire he had built as El Plaga was at its peak, yet the foundations of power he had relied on for years were beginning to show cracks. Rival gangs, once intimidated by his reputation, had grown bolder. Law enforcement, now well aware of his operations and influence, launched coordinated efforts to dismantle his network. Even the young men who had once idolized him began to waver under pressure, tempted by offers of protection or rewards from authorities and competing factions. For the first time in his life, Mateo faced a reality in which careful planning and ruthless strategy might not be enough. The first signs of collapse came from within. A trusted lieutenant, who had been with Mateo since his earliest days as a hitman, began to secretly communicate with law enforcement. Motivated by jealousy and fear, he leaked information about safe houses, operational plans, and key members of Mateo's network. The betrayal was precise and devastating. Mateo had learned to anticipate threats from rivals and outsiders, but betrayal from someone he considered loyal was a lesson he had never faced before. It forced him to reevaluate every relationship, every assignment, and every strategy he had relied on for survival. When the coordinated raids hit, the consequences were immediate and brutal. Multiple locations associated with his operations were surrounded by armed officers, and arrests were made. Weapons, drugs, and other contraband were seized, dismantling significant parts of his network. Mateo himself narrowly escaped, relying on the same meticulous planning and street knowledge that had carried him through countless dangers. Yet even as he survived physically, the psychological impact was profound. The aura of invincibility that had defined El Plaga for years was now shattered, replaced by the stark reality that his enemies both inside and outside his empire were capable of bringing him down. The cracks in his empire invited attacks from rival gangs. Sensing weakness, competitors moved swiftly, attempting to claim territory that had once been under Mateo's control. Skirmishes erupted in neighborhoods that had previously been quiet under his influence. Mateo responded with calculated strikes, eliminating traitors and punishing rivals, but each retaliation carried risks, drawing attention from authorities and creating a cycle of violence that threatened to spiral beyond his control. The balance of power he had carefully maintained was now under siege, and every decision carried higher stakes than ever before. As the pressure mounted, Mateo realized that his survival required more than brute force or tactical brilliance. He began retreating into secrecy, moving operations further underground and relying on smaller, more loyal teams. He refined his methods of deception, misinformation, and psychological manipulation, seeking to regain the upper hand. Yet even with these measures, the sense of vulnerability was new and unsettling. For the first time, Mateo Ramirez faced the frightening possibility that he might lose not only his empire but also the life he had meticulously constructed over years of violence, cunning, and ambition. By the end of this period, it was clear that El Plaga's dominance had entered a dangerous new phase. His legend remained intact, but the reality was precarious. The boy who had once risen from the streets to command fear and respect now had to navigate a web of betrayal, law enforcement scrutiny, and rival aggression, each threat capable of destroying everything he had built. Mateo's survival depended on a delicate balance of strategy, violence, and instinct, and the slightest miscalculation could spell the end of El Plaga's reign. Yet, even amid the looming threats, his intelligence and ruthlessness ensured that he remained a formidable figure, proving that legends forged in violence do not fade easily, even when the foundations begin to crumble. Even after Mateo Ramirez, known as El Plaga, was finally captured, his influence on the criminal underworld did not disappear. The legend he had created in Guadalajara and beyond continued to resonate, shaping the actions of rival gangs, young recruits, and even law enforcement approaches. Though behind bars, Mateo remained a symbol of power and fear, a reminder that a single mind, honed by years of violence and strategy from childhood, could outmaneuver entire criminal networks. His story was no longer just about a boy who became a hitman. It was about the terrifying consequences of a life shaped entirely by the streets, ambition, and a relentless pursuit of control. From his prison cell, Mateo's empire had fractured, but not vanished. Loyal followers, some of whom had been trained since their early teens, continued to execute operations in his name. They used coded communications, secret alliances, and underground networks to maintain influence, ensuring that rival gangs never forgot the reach of El Plaga. Even incarcerated, Mateo's decisions could ripple outward, affecting territorial disputes, resource flows, and the loyalty of criminal factions. The youth who once looked up to him now took leadership roles, perpetuating his methods and cementing his legacy in ways that extended beyond his direct actions. Law enforcement agencies, though successful in arresting Mateo, found themselves grappling with the consequences of his ingenuity. His empire had been designed with layers of protection and redundancy, meaning that removing one node did not collapse the entire structure. Investigations revealed careful planning and delegation, with contingency plans for betrayal and exposure. This forced authorities to rethink how they approached organized crime, recognizing that even the capture of a single mastermind might not immediately dismantle the system he had built. Mateo had, in essence, created a blueprint for enduring criminal influence, and his capture did not erase the lessons he had taught his network. The psychological impact of El Plaga's story extended far beyond immediate criminal circles. Residents of Guadalajara remember him not only for the violence, but also for the eerie intelligence and calculation that had defined his rise. Parents warned their children about the streets, while journalists and writers chronicled his path with fascination and fear. His story became a cautionary tale of how neglect, poverty, and exposure to violence could cultivate a mind capable of both extraordinary strategy and ruthless cruelty. Mateo's life served as a reminder that monsters are not born fully formed. They are often shaped by circumstance, survival, and opportunity, and once unleashed, they leave a lasting mark. Even in prison, Mateo adapted. He observed, manipulated, and strategized, understanding that influence could be maintained even behind walls. He forged alliances with other inmates, ensured that his followers respected codes of conduct, and continued to exert a form of control over those who remained loyal. While his physical freedom was gone, his mental acuity and strategic brilliance ensured that he remained a figure to be reckoned with. In the end, El Plaga's story is one of transformation, survival, and the enduring power of a mind forged in adversity. From a neglected child in Guadalajara to the most feared young criminal mastermind in Mexico, Mateo Ramirez exemplifies the terrifying potential of intelligence and ambition combined with violence.